So there's, I've got millions and millions and millions of topics I could talk on. And but just thinking about what I could speak on this morning. When when we hosted the conference in 2002, I believe I did just a general history of Revelstoke. Last year, Tom Limbury was up in Revelstoke, and we had him speak at one of our brown bag history sessions. And he actually recited back a fact that I had given in the 2002 talk. So I thought, well, I better make sure I say something different this time, even though it's 14 years. There's people here with prodigious memories who are going to catch me out if I repeated something I said 16 years ago. So I decided to talk about the Big Bend, and I gave it a little fancy title, The Romance of the Big Bend. It's an incredible piece of geography. The Big Bend is the area between Revelstoke and Golden, following the bend of the Columbia River as it travels north past Golden, then takes an abrupt bend and travels south, eventually emptying into the Pacific Ocean at Astoria, Oregon. The river is 1,210 miles long, the first 465 miles in Canada. The river has changed drastically with the dam construction as part of the Columbia River Treaty. And we think of the dams on the Canadian side of the border and how they have impacted the river. But we heard today from Stevie Seymour how the first dam on the Columbia River, the Grand Coulee Dam, in the 1940s impacted their way of life and stopped the Columbia from being a salmon river as it had been previously. So the first inhabitants of the river were First Nations people. This is a territory of the Sinaiaks, or Lakes Nation, and it extends from Kettle Falls in the state of Washington to Revelstoke and beyond. There's different evidence about the territory north of Revelstoke. We believe that this was part of the Sinaiaks territory, but it appears to have been a shared territory in some ways. In the map that I just had up on the screen, that map shows some trails from the Shuswap Lake over to the Columbia River. And we know that those trails were used by the Secwepemc, or Shuswap Nation, to travel to the Columbia River and beyond into the Kinbasket area as well. So we know that there was activity in this area. The Sinaiaks did have a permanent winter settlement in what's now the Big Eddy area of Revelstoke on the west bank of the river. This was a trading center for the neighboring nations, and trade goods such as obsidian dart points and lava stone bowls have been found in this region. If you had a look in our brand new exhibit last night, you would have seen some of those objects. The Big Eddy was also a center for trapping, hunting, fishing, plant and berry gathering. The Sinaiaks were known for their skillful hunting of deer, using small dogs to herd deer into the water where the hunters were waiting to harvest them. A story passed down among the Sinaiaks tells of a man who was walking through the forest, possibly near Revelstoke, and looked up to see dozens of caribou antlers in the trees. He was told that his ancestors would hide in the trees to shoot herds of caribou that were chased through the forest. They would take the antlers of the caribou they had shot and put them up in the trees to avoid scaring the next herds to be chased through. The explorer David Thompson mapped the entire Columbia River between 1806 and 1811. If you had a chance to go upstairs at the museum yesterday, you would have seen the exhibit that we put together on David Thompson back in 2011 on the 200th anniversary of his travels past Revelstoke. And when he passed through here and went back to Bolton Encampment, that completed his navigation of the entire Columbia River, and he produced the first map of this region, which opened up this area to the fur trade. His stories of traveling through that area, his journals are incredible reading. When you think of what they were doing and what they were accomplishing, they had traveled from Jasper to over the Athabasca Pass to the where the Wooden and Canoe rivers come into the Columbia at the top of the bend of the big bend of the Columbia River. And they did that in January of 1811. And you can just imagine what kind of a trip that would have been with the snow and what they were having to deal with to get to that point. When they made it to that junction at the Columbia River, David Thompson was named the Wood River. He originally named it the Flat Heart River because he said the men were so dispirited and their hearts were flattened by what they had been through to get to that point. But they established a base there that became known as Boat Encampment. And over that winter, they couldn't travel on the river at that time. So they were at Boat Encampment until about like April of 1811. And during that time, David Thompson, with just a simple axe, built a cedar plank canoe. And then in April, they headed upstream in the Columbia and then into the Kootenai and then eventually down to Oregon and then traveled back north. So that when they passed by here in September of 1811, that was the first explorer contact through this area. This photograph is from a painting by Paul Kane. Paul Kane was an Irish artist who came out west and managed to secure passage with the Hudson Bay Company to come out into the west to do painting and sketching. And he had arranged with Governor Simpson of the Hudson Bay Company to travel with them and paint scenes of the west. And Simpson had actually commissioned 12 paintings from Kane and arranged for Kane to travel with them to meet up with the fur brigade that had already left. But for some reason, Simpson left him behind. So Paul Kane had to find 3 teenage boys to get him 45 miles to Sault Ste. Marie. And Simpson again left him behind. But Kane was quite determined and managed to catch up and eventually arrived in Boat Encampment and continued down the Columbia where he continued to sketch. And his paintings are in collections throughout North America. This is a painting that he did at Boat Encampment. We have photographs in the archives, photographs taken in the 1940s of the same terrain. And we can see from those photographs that Kane did exaggerate the mountains somewhat. Boat Encampment now is, of course, underwater from the Mica Dam, but there was before that there was a plaque erected there, a cairn and a plaque erected in 1953. And when they were building the Mica Dam in the 1970s and preparing to flood the valley, they removed the plaque. And the understanding that I have is that it was supposed to have been sent back to Ottawa to be destroyed because it was unilingual. But for some reason, it ended on a clearing fire instead. And then from there, somebody rescued it. And when I started working at the museum in 1983, it was there in the basement. And we spent hours trying to clean it. It was almost unreadable. It was so black. But this is now hanging in the museum. A little bit of irony attached to that. Somebody from Parks Canada noticed it several years ago and said, well, you shouldn't have that. And Ruby Knox, who some of you may remember, said, well, you're taking it out of here over my dead body. So we ended up with a long-term loan agreement. This is the area on the Columbia River known as Death Rapids, about 45 miles north of Revelstoke. And it got its name for good reason. It was a very treacherous part of the river. There was a story told by Ross Cox, who was a clerk in J.J. Astor's American Fur Company. In 1831, he published a book called Adventures on the Columbia River. And he talks about an event where he was leading a large fur trading party eastward. And they reached boat encampment on May 27, 1817. They decided that 7 men in the party were too weak to make the trip across Athabasca Pass, and they were ordered back down to Colville, or Kettle Falls. It was felt that they could safely arrive at Kettle Falls in 3 days, so they were given 3 days' provisions. They made it to Death Rapids and disembarked. They tied a line to the canoe's stern and used poles to keep it from the rocks. Halfway down, the canoe caught a current, was swirled around, and the line snapped. The canoe was engulfed and smashed. The provisions had been left in the canoe. So there were 7 sick and weak men stranded on the banks of the Columbia River with no provisions and no way of traveling south except for on foot. This is the account from Ross Cox's book. It said, on the 3rd day, poor Bacon died, and his surviving comrades, though unconscious how soon they might be called on to follow him, determined to keep off the fatal moment as long as possible. They, therefore, divided his remains in equal parts among them, on which they subsisted for some days. Finally, only 2 men, Lapierre and Dubois, remained alive. And then, at last, 1 man only, Lapierre, was found on the upper Arrow Lake by 2 Arrow Lake's men. They took him to Kettle Falls. Lapierre said that he and Dubois were at the head of the lake, which we believe was where the town of Arrowhead was. And at that time, their food was exhausted. Lapierre began to be suspicious of Dubois, and one night he feigned sleep. He observed Dubois cautiously opening his clasped knife and tried to cut his throat. Lapierre stated that he managed to get the knife away from Dubois, and in self-defense, cut his throat. A few days later, Lapierre was rescued by the Sinaiac men. But later investigation, they found the remains of 2 of the other members of the party, and there was indications that they had been murdered, not died naturally as Lapierre had claimed. So Lapierre was sent east to trial, and one of the Sinaiac men was sent along with him to give evidence. But the testimony was circumstantial, so Lapierre was acquitted. Once the fur trade wound down, there were gold discoveries made on the lake, or on the Columbia River, and the tributaries into the Columbia River. There were a few men, there was Carnes, Downey, and several others who were in the area, and of course there are creeks now in that area named after them. They were some of the first that made some rich discoveries. And we don't hear as much about the Big Bend Gold Rush. It definitely paled in comparison to the Klondike and Caribou Gold Rushes, but it was significant nonetheless. There's estimates that there were $3 million in gold taken out in probably just a 2-year period, and that was reported gold. There could have well have been that much more again that was unreported. Because there were thousands of men flooding into the Big Bend at that time in search of gold, and the provincial Crown Colony was concerned that all of the trade was coming up from the south, and that the province was, the colony of British Columbia was losing out on revenue from people coming into the area. So Walter Moberly, the well-known surveyor, was commissioned to build a road, pack road from the Shuswap Lake at Seymour Arm over to the Columbia River. And he did do that in 1865, 1866. And Then he was also asked to lay out a town site at the community of French Creek. French Creek flowed into the Gold Stream River, and the Gold Stream River flowed into the Columbia, about 50 miles north of town. So that was his involvement in the gold rush in the area. He was also called upon to be gold commissioner for a while, so he was spending time recording claims when he could have been out doing more exploration and survey work. We're going to gloss over Moberly a little bit now because we'll be speaking about him more this evening when we do the dedication of the Moberly Memorial at the Revelstoke Railway Museum. This was a photograph taken in the 1960s of what we believe to be a remnant of the Big Bend Trail from the Shuswap Lake to the west bank of the Columbia River. I gave a talk just on Wednesday to a group of foresters in town and was telling them about the first sawmill in the region. There was a fellow named Lorenzo Bonato Romano, who we think was quite possibly Italian, who took a pack train of 12 animals from the Shuswap Lake over this rough trail to the Columbia River, and from there somehow got across and set up a little sawmill at French Creek City. And he was selling his lumber for $12.50 board foot. Another thing that happened during the gold rush was, he said there were so many men trying to rush into the area, and it was, a lot of them were coming up from the south, from the Colville, Washington area. There was a steamboat built at around the Kettle Falls area in the Colville area called the SS-49, and its job was, it was built to bring miners up into this area. It was captained by a man named Leonard White, and he made his first trip, or made it into the Big Bend area in 1866. For a while they were caught up in high water, and the photograph, the picture on that end is a photograph of an artifact in the museum. It's a blaze, tree blaze, where somebody carved the words, Steamer 49, delayed in consequence of high water, July 4th, 66. And the other sketch shows where a local man found the blaze and cut it out and brought it into the museum. That boat only really ran for one season. It was a very short-lived gold rush, and it was really petering out by the end of 1866. So when Captain White was taking people up into the area, he made sure that they had enough money to afford to be able to pay full fare and have a year's grub stay, or he wouldn't take them. But on the return trip back down, he was taking out anybody, whether they were flat broke or not, and most of them were at that point. As happened in a lot of the mining camps in the province, once a lot of the European white miners had vacated the area, Chinese miners moved in, and this is some Chinese artifacts that were found near French Creek by a man who still has active claims in the area, a couple of small opium bottles and a coin. But by the 1870s, there was really less than a handful of people up in that area. I talked about the Gold Stream River. This is the falls on the Gold Stream. And this is this photograph was taken by Earl and Still Dickey. Several of the photographs in the slideshow were taken by them. They were really a couple that we have a lot to be indebted to in terms of the preservation of our local history. Earl Dickey was born in Revelstoke in the 1890s, and his wife came here in the teens. And together they were responsible for recording a lot of histories of the early pioneers of Revelstoke, and they also took thousands of photographs. Earl became the publicity chairman for the Revelstoke Board of Trade, And in that role, he took lots and lots of photographs. He also took a lot of photographs of historic events and people and places. So we have more than 1,000 original negatives and photographs from the Dickey collection in our archives. And the book that Gillian mentioned, Reflections, is a collection of some of their photographs. Revelstoke as a community started really in 1885 with the coming of the Canadian Pacific Railway. And after that time, there was still a lot of people in the Big Bend. There was a lot of mining activity, even after the gold rush, right up until especially until the 1930s. But even in recent years, there's been mining going on in that region. So they were still looking at ways to get people into the area. This was a boat called the SS Revelstoke. It was built by a consortium of local businessmen in 1902, and it traveled up and down the river. We actually have the manifest book from the SS Revelstoke in the archives. This is the stretch that is just below where Revelstoke Dam is now. So those of you going to the dam today, you'll be passing by this area. This was known as the Little Dalles or Revelstoke Canyon. It was quite a treacherous piece of water as well, especially in high water. We've got an account in the museum of an earlier boat called the SS Lytton that was doing a trip up through the canyon in about 1894. And it took several men on the banks of both sides of the river with ropes lining the boat up through the rapids. And it took them 6 hours to get through this stretch of rapids. But on the return trip, they managed to get through the same piece of water in 6 minutes. The Revelstoke met a sad fate in 1915. It was tied up at a place called Commablix, which was a little town on the northeast arm of the Upper Arrow Lake around from Arrowhead. It was a big mining town, or sorry, a forest town. There was a very large sawmill there, and but they were not sure whether it was somebody dissatisfied with the mill ownership or exactly what the case was there. But somebody set fire to the mill in 1915, and it burned down all the mill operations, a good part of the town site, and the SS Revelstoke, which was tied up at the dock at the time. So that was the end of the boat. And even though the company offered a hefty reward, nobody was ever caught. The interesting thing is that it had to have been an inside job because you could not get in and out of Complex without people knowing about it. So this is a picture of some of the mining operations as they continued in the Big Bend around 1910. This is a man named George Laforme, who was one of the really remarkable Revelstoke characters. He was born in St. Hyacinthe, Quebec, and came west in 1882, traveling via Chicago to Winnipeg. He arrived at the railway construction camp around Lake Louise area in the spring of 1884, where he was running a small bakery in a log cabin until the fall. And then he moved west to Beavermouth and again went into the bakery business. In May of 1885, he hiked over the Selkirk Mountains by the Tote Road to the second crossing, which was currently Revelstoke. By the spring of 1885, he was prospecting in the Big Bend region, and he was mined and packed and trapped in that area for right up until the 1930s. He ran a pack train for many years and started that in 1889. He was a very familiar sight along the Big Bend Trail. There were 2 incidents in his packing career when he was snowed in and had to shoot his entire train of pack animals to prevent them starving when they couldn't get them out of the snow. That happened both in 1892 and in 1896, and he lost 24 mules and 11 horses in those two incidents.
Where were they backing to and from?
Backing from Revelstoke into the Big Bend, probably mostly as far as the Gold Stream, French Creek area. That's where most of the mining was taking place. And it was just rough tote roads at that time. After he retired, George LaForme lived on a small farm in Columbia Park and was well known for his strawberry farms. There was actually quite a few strawberry farms in Revelstoke, and they were exported from Revelstoke to Calgary and other nearby places. So we don't think of Revelstoke so much as an agricultural area, especially as a fruit area, but it was quite well known for strawberries. This photograph is taken on Front Street, and Front Street was the original downtown area of Revelstoke when it was established in 1885. And long story short, there was a dispute between the original surveyor, Farwell, and the CPR. And as a result of that, the CPR established their station where they are now, just across from Mackenzie Avenue to the east. And as a result of that, most of the local businesses wanted to be closer to the station. And so eventually the downtown shifted to where it is now, and Front Street was pretty much abandoned for several years. Now is solely a residential street. This was a ranch at Downey Creek, about 40 miles north of Revelstoke, and it was known as Boyd's Ranch, although Boyd was only there from the 1890s until 1902, but it retained the name Boyd's Ranch. Boyd had come to Revelstoke in the early 1890s as a miner, and in September of 1893, he took up a preemption of 320 acres of meadowland on Downey Creek and established this ranch there, which was near his mining claims. In July of 1897, his wife Alexina died of a stroke at the nearby home of the Bain family, who were also near at Downey Creek. She was just 26 years old at the time. But Johnny Boyd stayed in the area, and he drowned in the Revelstoke Canyon in May of 1902. He was with another man named Thomas Horn. And according to the newspaper accounts, Thomas Horn had ordered a Peterborough canoe through the local hardware store, and he had it made to his specifications. It was said to be one of the best canoes on the river. Thomas Horn was considered one of the most expert boatmen on the Columbia. They had been up in the bend around Downey Creek, were coming down, and they had picked up several others on the way, including George LaForme, who I mentioned. But three of the men decided that they didn't want to go through the canyon. They were really concerned about the state of the high water at that time. So they got out to walk to town, and men working on the tote road up above saw the canoe shoot up and disappear, and that was the demise of John Boyd and Tom Horn. But Boyd's Ranch continued to operate probably at least until the 1930s. The manifest book of the SS Revelstoke that I mentioned talks of produce being picked up at Boyd's Ranch and delivered up and down the river. There's another pioneer named Alex McRae. I was born in Ontario in 1877. He was actually a cousin of John McRae, the author of In Flanders Fields. So Alex came west to Revelstoke in the 1890s and was originally working as a steward on the SS Kootenai steamboat. He was helping to build the Jordan Trail and the Big Bend Trail in the region, and he was staking timber limits in the area. He also had a placer claim at 62 Mile in the Big Bend. He had the first contract to deliver mail up the bend, and in a while I'll be talking about the next man who had the mail contract. He was doing a trip of 70 miles once a month on snowshoes in winter, carrying 50 pounds of mail on a 6-day round trip. And Alex was one of the people who was on the trail in May of 1902 when Tom Horn and Johnny Boyd who attempted to run the water and were drowned. He said that one time traveling up the bend, he came across a mudslide and he found the opening to a cave. Inside, he saw what looked like Spanish armor. He didn't have time to investigate, but when he came back, he saw that more mud and rocks had come down, and he could not locate the cave anymore. So this is one of those great apocryphal stories that there's no way of ever authenticating, but it's a great story. This is a photograph of Alex McRae's mining claims in the Big Bend. These photographs actually came from the collection of my husband Ken's Aunt Marge, who's still living in Salmon Arm, and she was a great friend of the McRae girls, so she got to go on a trip up to their claim area, and these are a couple of the sons of Alex McRae. His family were all real noted skiers. One of them, particularly Don McRae, was expected to become a skiing champion, but he died during World War II in 1944. This is another real interesting looking character from the Big Bend, Elijah K. McBain. This photograph was taken by Earl Dickey in 1920. He had come out in 1894, and unlike a lot of these other people who were mining up there, he had a family, as did Alex McRae, and Alex McRae involved all of his kids in his operation as well. But a lot of these fellows who were up there were bachelors. Definitely could be a solitary life. So Elijah McBain was also a well-known timber cruiser in the area. There's a note in his obituary said his properties above Carnes Creek were considered of much value and were taken over by Regina interests about a year ago. He was on a visit to his properties at Carnes Creek when he collapsed of heart failure and died in 1929 at the age of 72. A lot of these people were mining well into their late years as well. And this is a picture of Elijah McBain's cabin at Carnes Creek in 1920, a really lovely looking little cabin, very neat and tidy. And we can contrast that with this cabin, a man named Kid Price. So there was a variety of characters with a variety of styles living up there. You can see this one, there's a couple of chairs up front that look to be made just of small trees. I don't know if any of you noticed in the museum yesterday, we have a chair made out of cedar bark that was found in one of the cabins at French Creek. Andy Kitson was quite a well-known local man, and he lived until the 1950s, so there was a lot of people who knew him well. He came out was born in Belfast, Ireland around 1878, and came to the USA in 1901 around age 22, and then arrived here in Revelstoke the next year, 1903. Was really interested in gold mining in the area. So he met up with somebody who had mining interests at French Creek and worked at his claims, and then eventually went into partnership with some of the other local miners, Gus Hedstrom and Tom Downs. He also worked on construction on the trails in the Big Bend. He was a partner with Elijah McBain, who we just saw, and was also doing timber cruising and assessment with McBain. He did a lot of trapping as well. Most of the men who had mining claims in the region also had trap lines. We have a ledger book from F.B. Wells Menswear, and Wells also did bought and sold furs from this region. And there is an account in there of, in 1914, there was one man who was paid over $600 for about 100 marten furs, and other furs that he brought in. This one man managed to make $1,400 with one shipment that he sold to Wells, and that was equivalent of almost a year's good year's wages back in 1914. So I think a lot of these fellows probably made more money on their trap lines than they did in their mining claims.
Were there fur buyers here in Revelstoke?
Yes, there were a couple of fur buyers. F.B. Wells bought furs, and then he would ship them. Actually, if you notice the big fur press in the museum, that was made for Wells Company. So he would bale the furs and ship them back east. And there was another man, J.H. Monroe, who also bought and sold furs. I did a whole brown bag history talk on Monroe. He was another real character. I don't know if you noticed last night in the museum there was a little case with a man's hat and a few other articles. There was the Rod and Gun Club magazine from 1914, and that had a cover story of this J.H. Monroe, who had, with another man, they had killed a bear in the Jordan River area, and they didn't know they were going to get a bear in their trap at that time, so they didn't really have a way of bringing it into town. And J.H. Monroe ended up carrying it on his back 10 miles into town. And they got into town, and he walked upstairs to a local photo studio and had his picture taken with the bear on his back. And that article made it into the Rod and Gun Club magazine. Andy Kitson took over LaForme's pack train, and in 1914 he had 26 head of horses in his train, and he worked that until the spring of 1919, packing for timber cruisers, prospectors, survey parties, and trail repair work. In 1920, Andy Kitson and Bob Blackmore led a man named Lewis Freeman from Golden to Revelstoke on the Columbia River, and Freeman went on to write a book called Down the Columbia. We have a copy of that in the museum. It's quite an incredible account of his travels on the entire Columbia River, especially this part with Kitson and Blackmore. In 1954, at the age of 76, Andy Kitson was sick and stranded at his Carnes Creek camp. He had left for Carnes Creek on September 6th to visit his trap lines and claims. His return was noticeably delayed. So a search party was organized by the RCMP, and they visited each of his trapline cabins until he was found on October 19th, sick and near helpless. He had suffered 3 strokes, one which had totally paralyzed his left arm. He had been forced to tear shakes from the porch of his cabin to burn to keep warm, and his food supply was very low. His cabin was 12 miles off the Big Bend Highway, with terrain only accessible by foot or on horseback. And they determined that they couldn't get him out on horseback, so a helicopter was called in. But due to poor weather, they couldn't get in for a couple of days. So in the meantime, a police constable went in on horseback with supplies for Kitson and the men who were caring for him. So finally on October 21st, the helicopter was able to get in to pick up Kitson. And the newspaper reported, on landing at the golf course, Mr. Kitson was in good spirits and apparently had enjoyed his novel trip. But that spelled the end of Kitson's time in Big Bend, and he ended up in a home in Kamloops where he died in 1955 at the age of 77. And at the time that he was taken out by a helicopter, he'd been in the Big Bend for just over 50 years. So another Earl Dickey photograph of Gus Hedstrom, who was another local miner prospector in the area.
Was there much gold? That's a local shop. Was there much gold found here?
There were people who did find reasonable amounts of gold, but I've never heard of anybody really making a fortune. I think in the Lardo there was more money made in some of the silver and lead ore claims than there were in the gold claims. This is some miners at French Creek around 1908. And a lot of them had fairly sophisticated operations in there. They had sluice boxes and flumes, and were working some fairly, doing some fairly serious work in there. And then some local men who had mining claims up there in the 1930s. This is a man named Andrew Westerberg, who earned the title Ole the Bear among the locals. And he was born in Sweden in 1879, and he came to Revelstoke in 1900. He began his career as a mail carrier to the Big Bend in 1914. We have a copy of his contract in the museum. He had his one-way trip to French Creek was 70 miles. And he was required to do 15 trips per year at $45 per trip. He was to make 2 trips per month in the 3 summer months, and 1 trip each month in the remaining 9 months. The weight of the mails were to be limited to 100 pounds each trip for the summer trips, and 50 pounds each trip for the winter trips. And this is how he traveled in the winter, either on skis or snowshoes. And we have a pack saddle and skis that he made in the museum. He had a farm south of town. It's actually called Westerberg Road now, where his family farm was. And they had 40 acres of land down there. There's various stories about how he earned the name Ole the Bear. One was that when he was on the trail during his mail route, he was bent over with the weight of his pack, and his vision was obscured. He rounded a bend and came face to face with a grizzly. He tried to run, but the bear closed in on him and slashed at his clothing. They were in a steep slope, and together the bear and Ole slipped and rolled in the slush and snow. Ole managed to get to his feet, staying away from the bear's claws. He recovered his rifle, which had fallen during the scuffle down the hill, and he fired at the charging bear. The shot appeared to have no effect, and it clawed at him. Ole ducked, but slipped, and the bear was on top of him. He could feel the warm blood flowing from the animal, and it died right on top of him. Ole eventually struggled out from under the bear, shouldered his pack, and continued on his mail run. And there was another story where he came to one of his trap lines, and there was a bear in there, but he didn't have his rifle with him, but he did have an axe. So he managed to actually kill the bear with an axe. There's another story that he was famous for. He was, in December of 1919, he was on his route, and the government had a horse tied up at Boyd's Ranch with what they thought was enough food for the winter. But Ole made a trip there in December and reported that there wouldn't be enough to feed the animal past the middle of January. And he was ordered to shoot the horse, but he asked if he could have the horse, if he could find a way to bring it out. And nobody expected him to be able to do that, so they said, sure, you can have the horse. So he tried to figure a way to get the horse out. He fashioned snowshoes out of gunny sacks filled with hay and straw. And he tried that for about half a mile, but it didn't work. So then he got willows, he made a hoop out of them, and strapped them onto the horse with rawhide straps. He walked the horse around the field until it got the hang of it. And then they started out in the morning, making a 40-mile trip in one day. And he got into town and tied the horse up outside one of the local bars and went in for a drink. And somebody came in and said, "There's a horse out there with snowshoes on." And Ole just casually said, "Yeah, that's my horse." And he wasn't making a big deal about it, but everybody else got quite excited. This was a portion of the Big Bend wagon road around 1915. As you can see, it was a very rough road and not very wide. But this is the road that people were using, a horse road and wagons. In 1928, there was a decision made to start construction on a highway to go from Revelstoke to Golden. At that time, it was the only way to get from Revelstoke to Golden was by train. And there were road systems starting to be built through the rest of the interior. There had been a road opened between Revelstoke and Sycamoose in 1922. So this part of the area was still really inaccessible. So they were looking at a way of putting a road in. The federal and provincial governments agreed to a joint completion of the highway between Golden and Revelstoke. Of course, there was a dispute about the route. There were some that felt that the route should follow the railway through Rogers Pass, but it was decided that because of the engineering difficulties through the Selkarts, that they would follow the bend of the river. And of course, it wasn't until 1962 that the Rogers Pass Highway was completed. It's a photograph of cutting the giant cedars before the construction of the highway. The route was 190 miles long. Construction began in 1929 from both Revelstoke and Golden, but it wasn't completed until the spring of 1940. So it was a pretty long road project, even by today's standards. This is bridge construction at mile 66. By April of 1930, only 30 miles were constructed on the Revelstoke side and 10 on the Golden side. In the newspaper of May 7, 1930, reported that 250 men were to be employed by mid-June, and $150,000 was to be spent on road building that coming year. But of course, by that time, the world depression was in full swing, so that definitely had a major impact on road building. It's a picture of a 46-mile camp in August of 1936. In September of 1931, relief camps were being constructed in the Big Bend for men to come in. And the relief camps were run by the Department of Defense. The men who were working there were paid $7.50 per month, plus room and board. So it was really just a work project. They were given something useful to do. They were fed and housed, but they weren't earning a wage, so to speak. And so obviously men with families couldn't work in those camps because they weren't earning money to sustain a family. There was found a long article in the newspaper that talked about the conditions of the camp. There was obviously a lot of people complaining about the conditions, so a local reporter went up and was talking about how clean they were and how well the men were fed and how many activities they had to do, and basically said, it's a great life. I don't know why anybody's complaining. So after the camps were closed in 1936, they continued to work on the road, and it was still continuing at a rather slow pace. But most of the construction was being carried out by local men at that time. The picture taken on the Downey Hill, north of 40 miles north of Revelstoke. This was before the road was completed all the way, but you can see it starting to look a bit more like a highway than that earlier trail picture that we looked at. So finally, on June 29, 1940, the highway was opened with an official ceremony at the Boat Encampment Bridge. The bridge was a steel truss with a curved upper chord and a clear span of 270 feet. An available width of 20 feet. The ceremony was presided over by Premier Patullo, Honorable T.A. Curator, who is the Dominion Minister of Mines and Natural Resources. And Patullo cut the ribbon and he said, "No tape, red or otherwise, shall hinder the progress of British Columbia." And there's a picture of the lineup. That's a good question. I'm not really sure. Sorry, did somebody have an answer to that?
How the river was in the United States?
really sure.
Trophy for expired last time.
Wasn't it an alternate route in case something happened to the river? During war?
It could have been. I'm not sure what what the American involvement was. But of course, they finally did complete they finally completed the highway because there was an urgency once war had started to provide a route across Canada. So that was definitely, I think that was the impetus for them to finally get this road built. One of the people on the platform was Catherine Fraser, who is often referred to as one of the first decent white women in Revelstoke, which gives the idea that there was probably others. Catherine Fraser was honored by Walter Hardman, who was the Revelstoke mayor at the time. He was Revelstoke mayor for about 25 years in all. They had 20 speakers in all, so imagine they were there for quite some time. They had a band, and the ceremonies were broadcast by the CBC. A free lunch was served with sandwiches, donuts, and pie, and 150 autos traveled over the bridge after the ceremonies, many of them continuing on to Golden. And there's Woodenhead. So Woodenhead is one of our local icons. There's a man named Peter Fiocco, who's a local man. There's still many members of the Fiocco family still in town. And in fact, if any of you happened to be speaking to Rosemary Tracy at the reception last night, she is a niece of Peter Fiocco, who carved Woodenhead. And Peter was one of the men working on the road construction, and he came across this stump that he thought looked an awful lot like a face. So he decided to help it along a bit and did a bit of extra carving and made him a hat. And then his road supervisor saw it and thought it was a pretty good idea. So they cut it off the stump where it was, and they moved it right to up to boat encampment and had it placed there with a sign that said, "Don't be wooden-headed. Drive carefully. You'll live to enjoy the scenery." And Woodenhead's lived up there until the Rogers Pass Highway was completed in 1962, at which time he was moved down to the junction of the Trans-Canada Highway right at Revelstoke, this side of the bridge. And he was moved around several times. He went through what I call his Spanish phase, when he had a long curly mustache. And he was starting to get in quite bad condition, so he was taken out and put in the public works yard. But people had a lot of fond memories of Revelstoke. He was kind of the equivalent of what our grizzly bear statues are now. We have quite a few pictures of people at this site on the Big Bend Highway standing up next to Woodenhead to get the pictures taken. So they did some restoration work for him and built a little shelter for him, and he now lives in Woodenhead Park, just this side of the Trans-Canada Bridge near the A&W. So you can go visit there anytime and take your picture with him.